Shuri, it's so lovely to have you back on the podcast. And since we last chatted, a lot has happened since the pandemic, and you've written this wonderful book. I wanted to get right into it. In recounting your journey of becoming a neurosurgeon, what are the main things? What are the main takeaways you want people to get from cutting a path?
Thanks, Rupi, for having me on again. It's really great to connect and see you after all these years. Yeah, writing the book was really a journey for me that kind of began about 10 years ago. And I was kind of finishing up my residency in neurosurgery at the time, and, one of few women in the program that had gone through. And I just felt like I had to share the story with people. And, the main takeaways from it are really, really I'll use the subtitle. It's really purpose, discipline, and determination, which is kind of the three hallmarks of the book. And I'll go back to purpose first, which is the first word in the subtitle, because I think it's important. We always talk about finding your passion, and I truly believe, yes, passion is a key component. But really, I think as a physician, it's really about your purpose. Why are you here? Are you here to help people? Do you enjoy being around patients? Do you like people? Do you want to help people? And I think for me, that was my purpose. And it's always kind of been throughout. And I think that was my main goal in putting the book out, was to tell people that we all have a purpose, whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, a scientist, in business. We all have a purpose on this earth. And I think identifying it and understanding our gifts and what we can give the world is very important. And so that's really why I wanted to put the book out, is to inspire people, and to show them using my story that, really anything is possible if you truly put your mind to it.
Hmm. I want to dive into this concept of purpose actually, because in a lot of ways, I feel very fortunate and lucky to know what my purpose is, what my passion is, and how I've been able to construct a life from my teenage years of really understanding what I wanted to do. Diving into the altruistic side, diving into the science side, and diving into that patient connection side, like actually having those relationship with humans. For someone who's reading the book or listening to this, how do they actually navigate exactly what that purpose is? Because I don't think this is just something for people of a younger age to understand. I think it's something that everyone at all stages of life should really be asking themselves and actually constructing a life where they can honestly answer to themselves, I am living a life with purpose.
Yeah, and that's a great question, because I think purpose can change as you go through life. I think you have, a purpose when you're a student, right? And the purpose is to get good grades and learn. And then there's a purpose, when you kind of move through life and you have a family, and then there's a purpose to provide. And I think, and then, when you have your children and you're watching them grow, and then there's a purpose to, provide guidance and advice and watch them live out their dreams. And then maybe there's a stage where they're no longer in the home, and then there's all sorts of alternatives, right? Like maybe there's no children in the picture, or maybe there's, or maybe you're caring for an elderly parent, or there's so many different scenarios. And I think purpose can change. Purpose is malleable. Our lives are malleable. Our lives are dynamic. They're constantly changing. Um, I think really looking at what gets you up in the morning, what makes you, want to get up, what makes you look at the sun and say, today's going to be a beautiful day. And what are the key components of that sort of living and that sort of lust for living that you have inside you. And I think once you identify that in whatever way it is, I think that's really, the the beauty of where life comes from and the beauty of where living comes from. Um, and it may not be easy to get to that purpose, for
Mm.
everybody, because we can be so bogged down with the day to day and the grind, and I think taking a step back and really examining, and self-examining and saying, what are the things that make me tick? What are the things that I love? What are the things I enjoy? what is my passion? What is my purpose? What are all these things? And I think once you identify that one thing, you go for it 110%.
Let's use your specific example as a way in which you really dived into your purpose and your passion, because as a US born Indian American, facing all the obstacles that you had to overcome throughout your journey of becoming a neurosurgeon in the States, how did you first find your purpose, and how did you know it was neurosurgery, considering all the hoops that you had to jump through, even more so, not only as a US born Indian American, but as a female as well. It's that there are so many challenges that you've articulated in your book. How did you know that that was your true purpose and that you weren't dissuaded from going down a different path?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always knew, even as a child, that I wanted to do something with the brain. I was absolutely fascinated by neuroscience, and going to the library, checking out books on medicine, checking out books on science, and always really wanting to, at the core of it, understand this mysterious organ, that holds all of our hopes, thoughts, and dreams, and just truly fascinated by it. And as I went through school, it was just working in neuroscience research labs, always involving myself in some sort of brain research or cognitive research. And then in the book, in the second chapter, I go into really the pivotal moment, which was my own mother suffering from a ruptured aneurysm
Mm.
when I was in my 20s. And my mother was this tigress, if you will, of a woman. I mean, she was on every board you can imagine. She was very active in the community. She was a professor of political science, a PhD. And one morning she developed a severe headache and was told essentially that she had a ruptured brain aneurysm. And that's when I met a neurosurgeon for the first time, who is Dr. Johnson, who I talk about a lot in the book. And he saved her life. And that was kind of a pivotal moment for me, because although I had been so interested in neuroscience, here was a living example in front of me of a save. He had just saved my mother. And his skill and his talent was so inspirational to me that I thought, this is my path. I want to save other people's mothers. That was my goal. And so, I went after that goal, knowing that whatever I did with this profession was so impactful to people that I would have the skills and the knowledge, just like he did, and the talent to be able to do that. And so it was a real life example, really for me. And I think even in the times where I struggled and the challenges that I had, whether it was, gender discrimination or ethnicity, and I did list some of those examples in the book. I always knew I had a path,
Mm.
and there's one example in the book that was kind of early on, was when I was a medical student, and I had invested all this time and energy in applying for neurosurgery, and I knew it was pie in the sky. I knew it was going to be so incredibly difficult to match. It's 50% match rate. I had done all these sub internships, and I was, at this interview, and this very, very well known, respected neurosurgeon, looked at my application and said to me, neurosurgery is really only for white males, and closed my application. And, what do you do with that information? I was in my 20s. I had invested so much time and energy in this. I loved it. And I had a real life example of my own mother sitting right in front of me, who was alive, and so, at that moment, I think many people have that moment. Many
Mm.
people have naysayers or people that don't believe in them, or maybe you don't even really truly believe in yourself, at times. But and so I think the ideas of overcoming those obstacles and powering forward despite the fact that you may have people that don't believe in you is really, really, important. And and I think at any stage of your life, whether it's as a student or as a parent, a grandparent, any stage of our lives.
I remember reading that moment in the book actually, and you use a French saying to describe something of having a sort of a quip, a comeback, but actually when the moment has passed, I can't remember for the life of me what that French saying is. I'm not too sure if you remember yourself either. But I've had those moments many a times, not obviously in that situation, but that sort of expression that needs to come to mind, of having something to say back to that. But you must have been gobsmacked, but at that point, particularly as someone who's in their 20s, perhaps is still gaining a lot of confidence, trying to muster a presence for themselves. I mean, what? How did you recover from instances like that?
Yeah, I mean, it was one of these situations where, before that, I had a lot of people tell me, don't go into neurosurgery or don't pursue this field because you're a
Mm,
woman. You won't be able to get married. You'll end up divorced. You won't be able to have children. So I'd had all of these people who weren't in the profession telling me that. But I guess what was really challenging was now to have somebody who was in the profession telling me that,
mm,
and so that was a moment where I thought, oh my gosh, is he correct? Should I not be applying for this residency because I'm Indian, because I'm a woman? Is he correct? And I had this moment where I second guessed myself, and it really was my support structure. It was my parents. It was my now husband, who were like, no, that's ridiculous, and didn't even give it a second thought, and just, that's ridiculous. Stay on your path,
mm.
hold your course. And I think, one of the things I talk about in the book too is finding your collective, finding your people, finding that your board of directors, if you will, the people that you go to for, your pieces of advice and bounce things off of, that you trust, and they have no ulterior motives other than wanting to see you excel. And so they've kind of been my board of directors throughout my life, and throughout the book I write about, talking to them when I had these very low moments.
Mm.
um, another very low moment was, when I became pregnant for the second time and I was a resident, and, pregnancy wasn't popular in the residency program. It wasn't done. And how that, affected me in terms of my colleagues and how they weren't supportive of that. And me wanting to be a mom, and, trying to balance all of those hats and all of those roles. And so, that's another, I think, key component in the book, is not just the initial going into the residency program, but remaining in it, and, having moments where I felt I may quit, which is what I had written about, when I was a 6th year resident.
Talk a little bit more about the unpopularness of pregnancy during residency for our listeners, because I don't think a lot of people would understand the psychology behind that, and perhaps the environment that residents across all different specialties, not just within surgery, but in medicine, and across the pond here in the UK as well. Those sort of unspoken cultural norms that perhaps non-medics wouldn't really be privy to.
Yeah, I mean, I think pregnancy in medicine in general has always been viewed, and I hope this is changing, and I think it's changing, but has always been viewed as a negative. It's always been, especially for surgical subspecialties, well, how much time are you going to take off? How are you going to make up the call? You won't be able to stand in the operating room for lengthy periods of time and do the procedures. So it's always been viewed as a negative. And I hope and I feel that it's changing. I think it's changing slowly, but I do feel like it is changing from my experiences that were, a decade ago. Um, the physicality of pregnancy is very difficult. There's water retention, your legs are swelling, your blood volume's increasing, you have, hormones raging through your body, you haven't slept, you've been fatigued. And, there's a lot of experiences that I had during both my pregnancies as a resident that, went beyond the, psychological to the physical aspects of the
Mm.
pregnancies are very demanding. And I truly feel like the pregnancies were the hardest things I've ever done in my residency, just because literally going into work every day and dealing with, getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and rounding and taking care of patients and operating all day. And then, leaving at the end of the day and my legs are like tree trunks, as I'm walking out. And, so that's one component. And then I think the other component is the psychological stress of not being supported at your program, and how that affects you also, and so, in the book I did talk about people that did support me, and I had a senior neurosurgeon who was very kind and was really a champion for me, and if I didn't have his support, I think it would have been all that more challenging, and so again I'll kind of go back to the collective, the board of directors, the people who want you to excel, because I think you need to kind of identify and find those people, and draw from them and draw strength from them.
Yeah, yeah. I wish I could say that it's changing for the better. I agree it's probably very slow, but the isolated incidents that are closer to home for me don't really speak to that. Actually, like one of my best friends is an ENT surgeon, and when she got pregnant, and intentionally and planned and stuff, she had very many of the similar questions that were posed to you as well about time off and how people are going to be restructured within the team, especially within the NHS, where we're strapped for doctors across all different specialties. And she was subject to a lot of bullying. And she's one of the best ENT surgeons in the country. And the same with one of my other good friends who does obstetrics and gynecology, the same things, and some very frank conversations with other female surgeons about, freezing one's eggs and actually having to jump through all these other obstacles that we as men who are not going to be bearing children don't have to do. So there's always going to be an inherent disparity in the escalation of one's careers just based on our life's opportunities and decisions. So it is slow, but unfortunately, I feel like we're still stuck in the dark ages when it comes to that facet in medicine.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with you. I mean, I do see some changes on at least the surgical side. I feel like it
Mm,
is a little bit more accepted. But I think the thing that bothers me the most is that the minute a surgical resident gets pregnant, it's perceived as if she's not committed to the field.
mm,
And I think because of, oh, well, you're going to be a part-time surgeon, and I felt that when I became pregnant, especially with my second, it was kind of, oh, well, she's not committed, or
mm.
she's going to be a part-time neurosurgeon, and everyone just assumed that. And I have 3 kids now, and I'm full-time. It's so I think the perception and the reality can be very different. And so I would say, never let anybody put you in a box. Never let anybody tell you what you are capable of or what you are not capable of, because you only know that from you, right? and
Yeah,
and so I think, and I really hope that in the next 10 years, we do see a change, because motherhood and bringing life into the world is one of the most incredible things I've ever done. And for women who are doctors to not want to do that for fear of retaliation or a lack of support would be a very sad commentary on medicine.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's very well put. I just on the subject of motherhood, I do want to go back to your mum's role and everything here, because beyond being the inspiration for neurosurgery and obviously her unfortunate experiences, like she sounds like a very powerful influence on you. Perhaps where the tiger analogy sort of comes from. Can you talk a bit more about your mother, and perhaps how she instilled the other elements of this book, the discipline, the determination, perhaps?
Yeah, my mother was, and still is today, just a very powerful force. She really propelled my career. She told me I could do anything I wanted in life, and um, never allowed me to back down if there was ever something that was in my way. And I think having her and watching her even battle her own health conditions and still today be such an active, functional person, it's been really inspirational, and I think everybody in their life needs somebody like that, where they're looking at them and saying, oh my God, if this person can do it, I can do it.
Hmm.
So, I think the biggest thing was she, obviously instilled education, the love of academics in me. But she also, taught me a lot about values and taught me a lot about, never backing down and being determined. And when people were telling you no, if you didn't believe them, well, you just keep doing what you're supposed to do, And, there were so many examples that she had given me of like, there's one in the book I loved that she had given me about track stars, the women
Okay.
that run track, and they have long nails and long hair and manicures and all that stuff. And so you would never think, why would a track star look like that? And same goes for how I looked in neurosurgery. I mean, I was a girl. I didn't defeminize myself because I was in a male dominated field. And so her examples of like, look at the other women in the world who, do what they do, and they don't look the type, One of the things that I really loved about the book is that I've had so many people reach out to me throughout the world who, I feel like it's becoming more normalized to be a woman, to be an ethnic minority. And I hope my story can do that for women. I hope that there are women who say, I may not fit the mold, but I really want to go into this profession, or I want to go into surgery in general, or I want to do something that is unexpected of me, and have the confidence to do that by looking at my story and seeing that, I was able to get, where I wanted to go ultimately, despite all of these things.
Yeah, and that discipline element that obviously is required in medicine. Like, how else do you instill that in the book? Because as a central pillar of what people should be expecting from your work and your experience in the biography of your journey thus far, like what other elements have you dived into to really sort of instill the discipline requirements for your journey, and how might that be applicable to somebody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think the discipline aspect, when you're in medicine, especially, we know all about discipline, delayed gratification, and I think above all, consistency. And, I think when we're consistent in our work, it's, we know we have to be somewhere at a certain amount of time. We're there. The work has to be done with excellence. Whether you're taking care of patients or whatever you're doing, there needs to be a consistency and a discipline in the way that you conduct yourself, professionally in your workplace. Um, because in many instances, there's something that happens at 2 o'clock in the morning, and all of a sudden you're in the operating room, taking care of somebody, and everything has been thrown out the window in terms of the logistics of the day. And, so I think for me, the discipline has really come from, a daily practice that's involved, meditation and yoga that is very consistent. I typically like to meditate and have a quiet moment for myself at least twice a day. But it's interesting because when I was a teenager, I had gone to visit my grandmother in India, and I met a yoga master. She used to have these yoga masters come to her home, and um, he taught me this visualization technique that I kept with me throughout my whole life. And he was really teaching me transcendental meditation, although he didn't call it that at the time,
Mm.
but he was really teaching me this concept of manifestation and visualization of a path, and kind of looking at a goal as afar, and then going through the steps of reaching the goal. And so I really held on to that throughout my life. And so I twice a day will sit down and have quiet time with this daily practice, and visualize what I want, manifest it. um, I was once told the universe is benevolent, and is on your side, and I really believe that. I believe, you're going to have ups and downs in life. You're going to have times of extreme stress. You're going to have times things aren't going your way. I think if you truly believe the universe is supportive and benevolent, um, I think you'll get to where you need to go. And, the yoga has really centered me. I do a daily yoga practice, even if it's 5 or 10 minutes. Somebody recently taught me about chair yoga. They said, Dr. Dewan, you can actually do yoga in your chair while you're at the office. So I thought that was kind of cute. Um, so I don't know if you've tried it, Rupi, but
I haven't
chair
tried
yoga
chair yoga.
actually,
No, tell me about it.
yeah. Yeah, so it's like, more about toning your core while you're sitting in a chair, and it's for people that are more office based. And um, so I think the daily practice of meditation, yoga, healthy eating, healthy living. I mean, all the more about healthy cooking, and how important our diet is to how we function at our best. Um, so I think incorporating all of those things has really led to the discipline that I have in my daily job, which is, you know, at its core, really, you know, opening the most sacred organ in the body and operating in it with confidence. And, I think that comes from centering yourself in your own life and also your personal life. I like to be very centered in my own personal life. And, someone had once told me that surgeons in general like to have equilibrium, and I think that really rings true. I think if things aren't good at home, it's very hard for things to be good at work. And especially in neurosurgery, because we're dealing with, you know, the most sacred organ in the body, and because our work is so important, I think it's even the most important component of what we do.
I want listeners to get a real understanding of just how disciplined you are to maintain a daily practice like that, mindful moments, because your job as a neurosurgeon is manic. It is just hugely intense procedures, but lengthy procedures as well, and call outs at
Mhm.
all times of day in the middle of the night and stuff. So, why don't you walk us through for listeners who wouldn't know about neurosurgery, like what a day could entail, and at what points do you have the discipline and that sort of that the rigor to be able to put in to slot in those daily practices, because that for me, just hearing that is phenomenal, but I don't think many people will understand why.
Yeah. Yeah, so I cover a hospital. We cover trauma. So what can happen sometimes is patients can come in and it's a very tenuous situation, and someone has to go to the operating room immediately. It's life. It's truly life and death. There's been instances where I've taken care of children that have been hit by cars, and they have bleeding in the brain and need emergency surgery. I've also taken care of the elderly that have had strokes. But a lot of these things happen in emergency situations. So, one minute you could be enjoying a coffee, and the next minute you're rushing off to the operating room. So it's almost like your mind and your body go into panic mode, and so I've kind of trained myself through the years of not getting into panic mode. It's a very
Mm,
controlled situation where, yes, there's somebody dying, and yes, I'm the one to save them. But at the same time, it's, become so rote with muscle memory, and, that, going into the operating room and performing that type of operation is it's second nature at this point. But I think mentally centering myself allows me to be able to take care of the emergencies, and remain calm and
mm,
focused while I'm doing it.
mm. And I think part of that um, that process of remaining calm is not even practice in the moment. It's after the moment. And I remember reading in your book actually about how you have this sort of traumatic imagination of you with the scar on your scalp when you were thinking about your mother in the hospital. And I don't know whether that was a recurring dream, but the sort of trauma of that sort of seems to have imprinted on you as you're going through your training and your specialty. And that sort of conjured a question for me as to how you would deal with something so traumatic as dealing with child fatalities and obviously the injuries that you see on a week by week basis. Like, how do you compartmentalize that, and how do you deal with the relaxation afterwards as well when these things are happening so frequently for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's actually, as a doctor, not dealing with those things is what contributes to, I think, a lot of our burnout, as a
Mm.
profession. And there's a chapter I have in the book which is put a pin in it. And the chapter is basically about how when you're dealing with the trauma and you're in the moment, um, and there's a scene in the book where I have a accident victim come in, and she had part of her scalp had been taken off by basically a barrier, and there was glass and everything in her brain. And how I was tasked as the neurosurgery resident with removing the pieces of glass from her brain in the emergency room. And as I'm doing it, she wakes up and starts having a conversation with me. And so in the moment, here I am as a young neurosurgery resident. And the moment I'm like in a Twilight Zone moment, where I'm like, is this a bad horror movie? Like, what is happening? But I also know that in order for me to help her, I have to step outside of it, take the glass out of her brain, get her upstairs to the operating room, and do what I'm supposed to do. So it's this, and she did great. The patient did well, and so it's this put a pin in it. It's okay, focus on the task. This may seem completely out of sorts, crazy, Twilight Zone, Hannibal Lecter type of situation, but, take care of the patient, deal with it, and then process later. And so after these really kind of horrific accidents or just wild situations that I had, I would go back to it, whether it was 6 hours later, 12 hours later, the next day, and kind of internalize it and say, like, what
Mm.
did I experience here? And how did that make me feel? And I think just doing that was my way of coping with some of the things that I saw. And I think we should all do that, and not just in medicine, just in general, because I think
Mm.
the tendency is just to push it down, and, not acknowledge it. And I think that that chapter really speaks to that.
Yeah, I love that expression, putting a pin in it. But I agree with you. I think a lot of times we just put pins in things and we actually don't unpin them a little bit later on and actually process exactly what we've pinned there, what we experienced, etc., etc. And I wonder if you can give us a bit of an insight into what it's like when you do unpin it, when you do reflect on your day or your week, and how you deal with those quite challenging memories and experiences.
Yeah, and it took me a long time, especially as a neurosurgeon. We do see a lot of death. And when I started my residency, it was very hard for me because I had never experienced, dealing with the patient who came into the emergency room who was essentially, there wasn't much you could do to save,
Mm.
and so that was really hard for me as a young resident, dealing with the death, dealing with the sadness, having to tell families, their loved one was brain dead, or having patients that I knew weren't going to make it in the ICU. But I think through the years, it's become, knowing that they got the best of me, that I gave them the best that I could, and also allowing patients in many ways to pass away with dignity. Because, one of the things, at least, and I know in some countries, probably maybe the UK, like in the United States, it's everybody always wants to pull out all the stops.
Mm.
Even if the patient is like 95 years old, and sometimes it's sitting down with the family and just saying, let's be real, it's a situation that there's no quality of life here. Yes, we could go to surgery and we could perform brain surgery, but this may not save your loved one in the way that you remember them. And I think having that conversation and allowing patients to pass with dignity, I think, is really important too. And that's one thing I've learned a lot throughout my career, and the way that I advise families, and um, is really that is you know sometimes pulling out all the stops when we get to our advanced age may not be the best option.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. We used to have something called the Liverpool Care Pathway. It's been succeeded by another series of protocols that can be locally agreed as well. I'm really privileged to have experienced such good palliative care teams in the hospitals that I've worked in. And actually, during my time in Australia, it was sort of the opposite, actually, probably similar to what you're describing in the US, actually, where it is a case of we will operate on anyone, we will throw all the drugs, all the interventions, and sort of leave the quality of life or the absolute extension of life to sort of one side, because really you just want to be giving 100% or 110% in many cases, all the time. And I think frank conversations with patients' families is certainly the way to go. But it is very difficult, as I'm sure you can attest to have those conversations, because you don't want to ever be seen as giving up or not putting enough effort in. But actually, you've got to be, it's beyond realism. It's actually what is in the best interests of the patient. And it's funny you were talking about having your board of directors, because I remember reading in the book, there's a character called Dr. Peter, I think, who is a experienced neurosurgeon who said something like, your life can be surgery, but your patients' lives aren't your life, and as long as you can do that 8 times out of 10, you'll be all right. And I thought that was so touching, because it's real, because as much as we try, our patients' lives always do seep into ours. And I'm wondering if that 8 out of 10 rule did apply to you, or perhaps it's been a bit more or less. I'm not too sure. What Why don't you tell us a bit more about that?
yeah, I mean, he's still in practice today. Is a great guy. And I think what he was trying to tell me is you can't take it home with you.
Mm,
I mean, because at the end of the day, we do what we do. We try to help. We do the best that we can to our ability. But we go home to our families, and we go home to the people that we love. And although I love my patients, and many of my patients have become friends and have become close to me, at the end of the day, I go home to my family, and so we can't take it home with us. I mean, we
mm,
have to. With my family, the minute I walk into my home, I put on my mom hat. The neurosurgeon hat is left behind, and the mom hat goes on, and I'm their mother, and I'm making their lunches, and I'm driving them to sports. And so I think, in so many ways, if we brought home everything from the hospital into our personal lives, into our home, I don't know if we'd be able to function as healthy individuals.
mm,
Um, because we all need a balance. We all need a yin and a yang to our day and to our lives, and we all need to learn how to deal with all the facets that we have in front of us. So that's something I've tried not to internalize. A lot of the things that I've seen, a lot of the things that have happened. Some things stay with me a little longer than other things. I'll have situations where maybe I felt a kinship with the patient a little bit over something, and that lingered with me.
mm.
I've attended funerals of patients that I've taken care of. Unfortunately, I've had to attend, funerals of children that I've taken care of, accidents and things like that. But I try to just, I guess I try to say, I did what I could for them in that moment, and be at peace with that.
Yeah. You mentioned a few concepts here that I think are really important for people if they want to develop their own toolkit of mental well-being. One of the things you mentioned earlier was delayed gratification, a concept that I'm obsessed with, because I think it's so important particularly in today's environment of instant gratification via social media or via your shopping, or there's never a need to wait for anything these days. And I think it expands to our careers. And if you think about medicine, the arc of your career will span decades, still in training. And the other thing is, this ability to compartmentalize, this ability to put a pin in it and reflect on it later, and ensure that you do reflect on it later, and being disciplined about that. I wonder, because you're operating obviously at the extreme end of these concepts, how would we essentially help listeners to this conversation develop their own mental health toolkit such that they can dive into these concepts of delayed gratification, putting a pin in it, being able to compartmentalize in their own lives, regardless of what situations, how extreme or not extreme that they're operating at? Like, what sort of tips would you give people, perhaps from that chapter, to start practicing today?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times societally, especially now more than ever, we're an instant society. We want everything right away, right now. We want, our food on time, our plane on time. Everything needs to be on time. And I think, in medicine, as you know, it's such a journey. And I do worry that people are going to say this is too lengthy of a career path for me, and I do worry that we're going to have less people interested in the field because of it. But what I would say is, when you get to the place where where you wanted to go, and it took you such a long time to get there, it feels just really incredible. And,
Hmm.
it's like no other feeling in the world. And I don't think, you don't need to be a brain surgeon to feel that. It could be anything, whether it's you want to challenge yourself athletically, or you want to climb Kilimanjaro, or even something, like a goal of getting your child potty trained, like my sister is currently doing. I mean, there's so many goals that you can have that just feel so amazing on the other end. And there's also a chapter about what's temporary in the
Hmm.
book. And there's one story where I was studying for the MCATs, and all of my friends were going out and just having the time of their lives. And they were like, Sheri, why can't you come hang out with us? And how come you can't go to this party and that party? And it was like this, because I'm studying for medical school, and that is our lives a lot of times in medicine, but in law, I mean, if you're a lawyer and you're dealing with legal cases, and I mean, in business, I mean, I have many friends in business who work harder than I do because, they have to take meetings all over the world, and, delay gratification of their companies and things like that. And so I think it's applicable to any stage in your life and applicable to any field, really. This concept of um, thinking about when you get to that place where you've reached the pinnacle, how great it's going to feel and how proud you are going to be of yourself for having stuck with it, and there is no price that you can put on that.
Yeah.
It's a completely different feeling, like a life moment.
You mentioned goals and visualizing. I want to dive into that a bit, actually, because I think, I goal set. I'm a big fan of visualization, or vision boarding, or actually, as Dr. Tara Swart, who's a friend of mine, a psychiatrist, and someone who speaks quite a lot on this subject. Um, she refers to it as action boarding, because a vision board is sort of like, something that you do and you don't really identify whether you can actually achieve it. An action board is actually, no, I'm going to action these things, these are going to happen at some point in my trajectory along life. How do you set goals, and what is currently on your action board?
So I am a huge planner and goal setter. Obviously, it's a part of me. It's who I am. Every year, I actually write them down.
Okay.
So I make a list for myself, and it's divided up into personal and professional as kind of broad categories. In professional, it can be anything. It can be, I want to learn a new technique. I want to go to, a course in X city to learn something. Um, the personal side is also anything. I wanted to learn how to ski last year. So, that was on my personal list. And then the third category that kind of developed over time was so it's personal, professional, and then family is my third category. And then
Okay.
the family goals are, what do I want for my family for the year?
Mm.
And I usually do 3 goals under each category. And at the end of the year, I'll refer back to it, usually around October, just to make sure that we're kind of on track with where I want to be. So I'm a huge goal setter. In terms of what's next, I mean, I feel like in so many ways, I've always wanted to be a neurosurgeon. I've always wanted to be an author. I've always wanted to be a mother. And so, and a good wife. I've been married 18 years. And so I feel like I've checked a lot of the boxes of things that really, you know, really I wanted. And, what comes next? I mean, I have another book that's going to be hopefully coming out in the next 2 years. But really, it's time for me to kind of help my kids realize their dreams
Mm.
and really be a light post for them to go out into the world and do wonderful things. And so, I think my next goal is really getting my family and my kids where they need to be, which is kind of independent, functioning, wonderful human beings that get put out into the world to do great things.
Yeah. I mean, you're such an inspiring character and a role model for people across the world. I mean, just reflecting on some of the things that we've talked about today, goal setting, a form of transcendental meditation, setting time every single day to ensure you have mindful moments. Are you quite different to your colleagues? Because most of my friends in surgical specialties don't really talk to me about this kind of stuff. If I'm honest, they don't really seem to have these kind of practices, least daily. Anyway, I mean, do you see yourself as quite out of the ordinary compared to your neurosurgical colleagues, or in medicine in general?
I think I'm probably somewhat different. But I do feel like there are quite a few people that I'm starting to meet now that espouse to, I mean, talking about mindful moments and meditation is actually more common now in the operating room than it ever
Mm.
used to be. I mean, I mean, 10 years ago, if you were to tell the OR we're going to do a mindful moment before starting surgery, you'd probably be laughed out of the operating theater. But now, actually, there's a lot of neurosurgeons that espouse to it. There are people that have like a huddle or, and I think it's actually a lot more common now than it used to be. And I think the old breed of surgeon is slowly kind of moving on, and new breeds of surgeons are coming up that are, more about, multifaceted life and, really a balance that probably wasn't ever dreamt of, 10 years ago. So I think there is a new crop of a new generation of surgeons, at least that I see. Um, and some of my colleagues, my older colleagues, I feel that they also, I was listening to one of my senior colleagues talk about doing yoga the other day, and I thought, wow, I never would have pictured that individual doing yoga, but it's there, and I think it's a lot more accepted now, um, and I hope that me being around them has kind of allowed them to think about the career and the profession in a different way too. So.
It's interesting because, like, I've been sort of talking about this for a little while, and I never would have imagined some of my friends doing this as well, in different industries, and in different backgrounds. But it seems to be a thing that's creeping up. What do you think is on the horizon that perhaps people aren't talking or doing right now, within medicine, that might become commonplace in the next like 5-10 years?
Well, I think, at least in my profession, I feel like, just robotics and
Mm.
AI are even more important now. And I think AI is going to just be a huge explosion for us in the next 10 to 15 years. And how we use that. The other day, I was talking to somebody, and they were telling me how they had developed this AI technique to identify depression in patients. And when they were calling the suicide hotline, and how they were using AI to kind of help screen through these patients. And I thought that was just incredible change in how we view mental health and medicine in general. And I think we're going to see more of that,
Mm.
and I think we're going to become more well-rounded as doctors, and I think our patients are also going to take more initiative on their health too, which I already see.
Yeah. And in
I
what way
already
do you
see a
think?
lot of patients who are.
In what way do you think they're taking more agency over their health that you're seeing today?
I think at least what I see a lot of is I see a lot of spinal disease, and
Hmm.
in many patients, at least in the U.S., obesity is a major issue,
Mm.
and you know, telling somebody that weight loss is going to be actually the key to their spine health can be a very difficult conversation in many ways, and
Yeah.
so now I think, one of the things we instilled was actually a bariatric program, and we have, a situation where we're now referring patients to nutritionists and aqua therapy in the pool and bariatric surgery if needed, instead of just telling them, okay, let's go do a spinal operation and a fusion surgery on you that may or may not benefit. So, and people are receptive to that, more so now than I think 10 years ago. So
Mm.
I do wonder if some of the COVID effect of people not wanting to be in the hospital per se, as
Yeah.
much plays into that, where they're saying, wait a minute, let me look at my physique and let me see, if my BMI is so high, maybe if I brought my BMI down, that would be beneficial to me. So I think they are taking more agency over their own health.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's spilling over beyond just nutritional medicine for the likes of cardiovascular health. People are looking at their plates as a way to mitigate against mental health, inflammatory disorders, spinal disease, as you've just said there. Are you seeing more sort of medically tailored meals or the sort of studies looking at food as medicine? Because I feel that America is probably a little bit further ahead of the curve than the UK on this. Probably out of the severity of the need based on the metabolic illnesses that you guys have got a higher prevalence of over there.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of patients who are very in tune with anti-inflammation diets.
Mm.
I have a lot of patients that have spinal arthritis, so they're developing, total body, total neck pain all the way down to the tailbone. They're taking turmeric. They're, really focusing on inflammatory, markers in their blood, and how they can bring those down. And so it's a lot more accepted now than it used to be, and it's not more common for us to say, okay, let's go a holistic approach. And I think that's really the way to go. I mean, surgery is obviously there for people who need it, and but I've always espoused to conservative management first, and conservative management includes the healthy lifestyle and the dieting and proper weight, before the operating room.
Yeah, and you mentioned AI there and robotics. On what side of the coin do you sit in terms of whether AI is going to eventually take over the role of the surgeon and the medical practitioner, or do you feel like there's always going to be a requirement for a sort of human interface, if you like, or humanoid?
I think so. I use robotics in my practice. So I started using spine robotics a couple years ago to put in spinal screws. So I did adopt it. I do remember being at a conference about 10 years ago and seeing the robot presented. And I thought that will never happen. It's never going to happen. But, now I'm using it a couple years later.
Yeah.
Um, I do think, though, that you will always need a surgeon or a human, or there is that pendulum that swings, where you become too technologically driven and then you lose the human capacity. And I think you do always need to have the human touch, no matter what it is.
Mm.
So I don't think robots will ever fully take over. I think we're always going to have a need for sure.
How old are your children? Sorry if you don't mind me asking.
So my kids are 13, 12, and 10.
13, 12, and 10. Okay. And in terms of their career trajectory, particularly your eldest, I guess they're thinking about, what careers they might want to pursue. Is medicine something that you would advise, would want them to go into at this stage, considering, the rise of robotics and AI and all the other things, and also the stresses on the medical force as well? Or would you gently be nudging in a slightly different direction?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I've been asked that question so many times about my daughters, especially. I have the two oldest are daughters. And people have asked me, would you advise your daughters to go into medicine? What are your thoughts about it? It's a really tough question. And I think it honestly depends on each child's personality.
Mm,
Um, I think medicine, it really is a calling. It is such a long road and wrought with so many different obstacles that, if one of my daughters really wants to do it, I would 110 support her path. Um, that being said, I want them to fully understand what they're getting into,
mm,
because there are a lot of things that your friends in business and your friends in law are never going to deal with, and they're never going to take somebody's life into their hands. And so I think that I would fully support them. One of my kids really doesn't want to do anything with medicine. She's more interested in business. But my middle child has really expressed an interest in neurosurgery and, in medicine. And so I want to foster that interest, but I also want to be cautious and show her. I mean, I think one of the things that is the biggest accolade is if your child wants to follow in your footsteps. To me, that's really just that says it all. You haven't destroyed the profession for them mentally, and
yeah, yeah.
I have so many friends whose parents are doctors and they want nothing to do with it, and so I feel like hopefully I've shown her that you can have a balance and you can have a multifaceted life and you can be good at several things. And I hope I've instilled that in her. And, with the way things are changing, I feel like I don't even know what job they're going to have because at their age, it may not even be created now. They're going to have
Yeah.
some probably specialization even within medicine that's, a robotics driven fellowship or some sort of track in medical school that's AI driven or something. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see where the pendulum swings.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's fascinating. I'm chatting to people of various age groups right now, and they're asking me this question. So I'm trying to garner as many responses as possible from people in various fields, just to get an idea of, what the perspectives are, what the thinking is in various specialties, because it is a hugely disruptive time, a very exciting time. I'm like an eternal optimist. I just think medicine's going to get better as a result of AI and machine learning. We're already seeing that in both clinical and non-clinical hospital environments. So I'm pretty excited about it. But you're right. I think the job descriptions and the job opportunities are going to vastly change. Like even looking at myself, who would have thought that there would be a role for a general practitioner who espouses the benefits of eating well in a public health arena using social media as a platform? It's just you can't really predict these things.
No, and that's the beauty of life. I think it's so malleable, and it's so dynamic, and we can do so many things. We can be so multifaceted that that's the beauty in life. I mean, who would have ever thought an Indian woman could be a neurosurgeon and be an author and be a mother of three, and so you just you kind of have to do the things that feel right to you, and whether people view it as the norm or not, I don't think it really matters anymore.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, look, thank you so much for writing. What is a wonderful piece. I love your writing style. I think people are going to absolutely enjoy it and come away inspired from it. And I think how you've packaged purpose, determination, discipline is wonderful. And using your own story and being vulnerable with all the things that you've shared, I think has been fantastic. So yeah, I can't wait for other versions of it. Let's say beyond the written word. I'd love to see it in a different form. But yeah, no, congrats. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure coming on with you and talking about the book. And obviously, congrats to you too and all of your successes. So inspiring to watch you as well.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Sherry. If you enjoyed that video, you'll love the library of content that we have on thedoctorskitchen.com. Make sure you hit subscribe, and we have podcasts in our library on brain health, well-being, supplements, and lots more. Have a wonderful day.